So we're talking this morning about winning impossible battles, yet they're not really impossible. Some accounts in the Bible that we read are really, shall we say, almost too outrageous to be true. You know what I mean? And what we're going to look at this morning is certainly one of them. But when you read phenomenal passages like the well-known story of David and Goliath, it's just difficult from our own mind to wrap it in our own mind, considering what God can do. And we don't doubt that God can do great things, but when we read things that are so foreign to our experience, that's what's a little difficult to wrap our minds around. Last week we read the account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. That's another one that's really difficult to wrap our minds around, because I don't know about you, but I've never seen a dead person brought back to life. I believe God through Christ can do it, absolutely. I believe in resurrection. But these are things I've not seen, experienced firsthand. So some of these things are rather difficult to wrap our minds around. But David and Goliath is such a phenomenal story, probably one of the most familiar, even to people that don't know that much about the Bible. So since I'm sure this is a well-known story, we don't need to focus a whole lot on the actual narrative, because we pretty well know how it goes. I know I've used the illustration before watching a movie about the Titanic. You're not surprised when the ship sinks at the end, because that's the way it goes. You're not surprised at the story of David and Goliath, because you know how it turns out. But it's a phenomenal story. And I'm thinking about anybody who ever as a child went to Sunday school probably learned a little chorus, and we're not going to sing it. I guarantee you I'm not going to sing it, but you probably know the words. Only a boy named David, only a little sling, only a boy named David, but he could pray and sing. Only a boy named David, only a rippling brook, only a boy named David, and 5 little stones he took, put in the sling and round and round. Yeah, well, you know how it goes. It sounds too good to be true, but the reality is of this great story, it's too good not to be true. And so maybe because the story seems rather outrageous, maybe for that reason in the Bible narrative, we have some very specific details to verify it. So this is not just stuff of legend. This is verified stuff. So right away you can see there's a map up on screen based on verse 1. And that's a Google Earth, Google Map scene of today as to where it actually took place. That might kind of help us to really visualize the whole story, that it really took place in a very specific location. And apparently if you were to travel to Israel, you could actually go to the very spot, because it's identified right away here in verse 1 of chapter 17. So verses 2 and 3, we'll pick up our reading there, and we'll read some of the narrative for sure. Because verse 2 says, Saul, King Saul, and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. Now, we don't have a picture of that, but it's pretty easy to picture that in your mind. This is the battle scene, the battle scenario. So we've got 2 mountains. And so day by day, you've got the bad guys, the Philistines. They're coming out on one side of the mountain. You've got Saul and the people of Israel on the other side, and there's a valley in between. So there's a standoff that goes on every day, but 2 armies on either side of these mountains with a valley in between. Now, when I think about the valley between the 2 mountains right away, I wonder if there isn't a bit of symbolism in that, because that figuratively can represent the battles that we face, because they take place in the valleys, don't they? The good times are up on the mountains, the heights, but the valleys, the valley of death, as the psalmist talked about, the valley of despair, the valleys are where the battles take place. And if there's to be a battle, that's where it's going to take place in the story. So verses 4 to 7 tell us that a champion by the name of Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. And I'm using this translation because we can relate to the facts, the figures. He was 9 feet, 9 inches tall, and wore a bronze helmet and bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. Maybe you can bench press 125. I'm pretty sure I can't at this stage in life. There was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze sword was slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. I pause for a moment. Goliath's pretty impressive in size and all that, but I'm thinking of the shield bearer, kind of the unsung hero. What size of a shield are you going to need to carry to protect a 9-foot, 9-inch man? So he's got a pretty big job himself. But anyway, that's the size of Goliath. So if you happen to think that Shaquille O'Neal was big, well, he was probably pretty small by comparison. Now, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and you got a picture to look at here, and you can believe it or not, I guess. That's why they say it's that. The tallest man ever, who was born in 1918, lived only about 20 years of age, a guy by the name of Robert Wadlow, was 8 feet, 11.1 inches tall. Just shy of 9 feet, which means he's 9 inches shorter than Goliath. So maybe that helps to wrap your mind around that just a little bit. Verses 8 to 10. So it says in verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become servants and serve us." Again, the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." I'm guessing Goliath didn't lack confidence. But then I guess if you're 9 feet, 9 inches tall, a mountain of a man, with all that armor, all 125 pounds of it, and a massive sword, what is there to be afraid of? So we get the idea there's this challenge every day, a one-on-one challenge. You send a man over, and if he can kill me, well, fine, we'll serve you. If I kill him, you serve us. So the challenge is on. Apparently, this whole standoff took place over 40 days. We are told elsewhere here that they did this sort of thing every day for 40 days. Imagine that. You get up in the morning, eat breakfast, suit up, go over to the side of the mountain, each army, facing each other. I don't know how long, if they were there 8 hours, if they were 12, however long. For 40 days, every single day, they suited up in armor, went there, looked at each other, listened to this giant of a man taunt, and issue this challenge, and at some point, it's like, well, let's go back home. Let's go back to the camp. So they go back, and they come out and do the same thing again. 40. And I think, whenever you hear 40 in the Bible, there's always a significant number, because 40 always represents testing. Talk about testing. You think about the Israelites, 40 years in the wilderness. Elijah fasted for 40 days. Jesus fasted for 40 days. So 40 is always a significant number in terms of a time of testing. And so the Israelite army, King Saul and David, it indeed is a time of testing. And if you want to bring it on down to us, the taunting of our enemy, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, severely tests us as well. We are taunted by an enemy on a regular basis as well. We know that David accepted the challenge that he would be the one to go fight Goliath. So if you look down in verses 38 and 39, now that he's made his intentions clear, it says, Saul clothed David with his garments and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor. And David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, but he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." And David took them off. That's another scene that you can picture. King Saul was a head taller than everybody else, so he had to have some pretty big armor, not as big as Goliath's, But David, we don't know how tall he was, but we get the idea he was not a tall man. And he's just a youth at this particular time, a young teenager probably. So you picture him putting the big man's armor on, trying to put all that on, saying, this isn't going to work. I can't move, I can't walk, I can't maneuver. So this is not going to work. And so it's important to have the right armor for the right battle. Thinking about a book that I'm reading right now about a well-known Major League Baseball player telling his story, and he talks about how some more experienced retired baseball players advised him on using the right bat. He had a bat that he thought worked well, but given the advice, you need this bigger bat. And so that's what he did, and that was a real key to his success. You got to have the right weapon for the battle, so to speak. So the battle demands the right armor. And 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 to 5, talks about the battle that we are in and the appropriate armor, because the Apostle Paul here says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So the nature of the battle demands a certain kind of armor. So I'm looking down to verse 40 here in our story, and it says that David took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So Saul's armor didn't fit too well. Saul's sword didn't work too well. So David, the young shepherd boy, chooses some pretty unconventional weapons. He goes down and he picks up 5 smooth stones out of the creek, the brook that no doubt was in the valley between the two armies. And throughout the ages, people have asked, why did David pick 5? Why not 1? If you really trusted in God, that one shot's all you're going to need. Why 4? Or why 4 more, I should say? Did he expect he's going to have to use those? Miss maybe the first time? 4 more chances to hit the giant? What's the story with 5 stones? And it's all speculation, but this might be why, because Goliath had brothers. He had children, sons. Likely they were there. And perhaps he's speculating that he might have to take them on as well, but who knows? That's just merely a thought. So he goes armed with a sling. I don't know about you, but I often think about sling. I think of slingshot. I'm thinking about that little Y-shaped wooden stick thing that a lot of us made when we were young boys. Taking a piece of an old inner tube, maybe a little piece of leather. Not a real formidable type of a weapon. The sling that David used was probably circular, probably some kind of a leather belt type of a thing. And apparently we're told that those who were experts with a sling could propel a rock at speeds approaching 100 miles an hour. So if David was good with the sling, and no doubt he was, sort of like getting drilled with a major league pitcher's fastball, 100 miles an hour. So David was indeed skilled with the sling, but I personally believe it was God who gave him the target lock. Because you got to wonder, what are the chances of a stone flying in the right trajectory, right into the opening of a helmet, crashing right into this giant's forehead? I think it takes more than just being a good shot, but that's just my opinion. I think God guided that. But the thing that stands out in all of this is the faith, the confidence, the character of David. And so that's where we focus our spotlight. Verse 26 of this chapter, David says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The kind of man that David was. He was concerned for God's reputation. This wasn't about David. This wasn't about Israel per se. It was about God's name that the people of Israel would bear. Chapter 4 that we looked at several weeks ago, the Philistines, the enemies that continually were taunting the Israelites, the Philistines had defeated Israel. They had taken the Ark of the Covenant. Verse 26 back in chapter 4 says, the glory had departed from Israel. And what a tragic thing, because Israel, again, bearing the name of God, it was a very terrible thing. God's name was disgraced. And that was the thing that mattered the most to David. So verses 31 to 37 in our chapter here this morning. It said, when the words which David spoke were heard, they were told them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, love this, let no man's heart fail on account of him, on account of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he's been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from its mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by the beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. When I read those words, I see that there's not an ounce of cowardice with David. He brims with confidence. But was he brimming with self-confidence? I think absolutely not. You see, the confidence that he had was with his heavenly Father and not with himself. David, as we're told here, was just a youth, a puny young teenager. But as Saul said, the enemy he's about to face has been a warrior from his youth. We don't know the age of Goliath, but he's been around a while. He's fought a few battles. He's an experienced warrior. And so just to look at them, talk about a mismatch, a young shepherd boy who really doesn't seem up to the task, and a very experienced warrior, a mountain of a man in many, many, many ways. So David was indeed very young, but David certainly was not naive. From what we read here, David approached the battle with eyes of faith wide open. And as we read, David had a track record as a shepherd, killing off wild animals that came to prey upon the sheep. But again, David was confident not in his own abilities, but the abilities of God. I look back at verse 37. He said, the Lord who has delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, he's going to deliver me from the hand of the Philistines. He knew that God had been working with him to give him those victories. Thinking about all the time that he had out in the pasture, tending to the sheep, him and God. And he had seen God work time and time again. And so he had that track record. God has been with me. We've defeated enemies in the past. This is just another enemy like a bear or a lion. God who has rescued me will rescue me from him as well. So again, he has that tremendous confidence and faith in his God. The absolute pinnacle is his declaration of faith that you read in verses 45 to 47. This is what David said to Goliath, a towering 9-foot, 9-inch man. Verse 45, he said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth, I love this, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all the assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hands. David bristles with godly confidence and faith. As you read here, David knew the outcome of the battle before it was ever fought. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He's going to lop off the head of the giant. What an outrageous thought. But it happened exactly as he saw it. He had seen the victory before it ever took place, and that is exactly how faith works. It takes us back to Hebrews 11:1, the definition of faith. Faith is the reality of what is hoped for. It is the proof of what is not seen. David's the epitome of that. He's operating that way against incredible odds, against impossible odds. David is about to take on this giant, and through eyes of faith, it turned out exactly as he envisioned that it would. But there again, this was not about David. This was not about Israel. This was about his God's fame and reputation. He says, in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted, this is how the victory will come about. In the name of Yahweh, the Lord of hosts. So in essence, what he says to Goliath, as he's no doubt looking up, what he basically says, you may see a puny young shepherd boy standing before you, but it's not me that you are really facing, because you are facing the God of the universe, and you've had a nasty habit of taunting him. And God doesn't put up with that sort of thing. So I think that's the essence of what he says. The battle will be won for God's reputation, not for David's, not for Israel, that all the world will know that Israel has a God. And when I read that phrase, I feel a heaviness as I think about Israel then, and I think now about Israel today. I feel a burden. It's been a growing burden in recent months, a burden for the Jewish people. And when I read what I've just read here, I think if only the people of Israel knew that they had a God and that they had a Messiah in the person of Jesus the Christ, God's Son. Oh, if only they could see that. I prayed daily for the peace of Jerusalem. I had not been in the habit of doing that for a long time, but of late I have felt a tremendous burden to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, because scripturally we're called to do that. And the only way there will be lasting peace in Jerusalem is when the Prince of Peace comes, and the only way he's going to come is when the people of Israel will respond to what Jesus said 2,000 years ago when he was about to leave. He said, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Oh, we want that to happen so badly, don't we? We want their eyes opened in faith, that it may be known there is a God in Israel, and a God who has a Son, Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. We long for that to happen. So I think of that as I read that verse. As we know, David saw the battle for what it really was. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So really, David put it all on the line for Yahweh God. It was, again, for his fame and his reputation, not for David's. What a great story. We know how it turned out, exactly as David envisioned it in faith. But I think that this entire epic story, so well known, really foreshadows the battles that we face. This is really what it's about, because it depicts the battles that we face as well. So we might say that Goliath was a type of our enemy, namely the evil one, who is ever trying to destroy the plan of God and the people of God. And we know that our Goliath, so to speak, tirelessly taunts us as well, as he did the armies of Israel. So we might say we have an enemy that trash talks us on a regular basis. You think about what Goliath said to David. He said, come here and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. Well, maybe our enemy doesn't exactly say the same thing to us, but indeed he does trash talk us as well, saying things to us in our head, you know you're never going to amount to anything. You call yourself a Christian, and yet I see the way you live your life. And look at all the sins that you've committed, really to believe that you're forgiven, and things like that. We have an enemy that taunts us, trash talks us in the same way. You know as well as I do, it's awfully easy to listen to what he says, and we can end up dismayed and greatly afraid, as verse 11 said of the Israeli army. If we're not careful, we listen to that enemy. Goliath and the Philistines in this story were enemies that were camped in Israel's territory. You go back to that map we started out with, they were in the territory where they didn't belong. It's not like they were over on the border in their land, in their country, ready to invade. They were already there. So they were already in the land of God's people where they did not belong. And I'm thinking that's the way our enemy works as well. He managed to get into our territory, And we've got to do something about it because he's there and the battle needs to be on. And so we need to do more than the armies did for 40 days in the story, where we just put on our armor and we face off every day and do nothing else. And I'm not minimizing the armor. We got to do that. Ephesians 6 talks about every day putting on the armor of God. We need to do it, but we need to use it. And so not just standing there looking at the enemy and then finally stepping back and going back to our camp. We need to deal with the enemy and deal with him decisively, as we learned in the story here. So the Goliaths that we face are not 9 foot 9 inch tall men. They are invisible enemies, but they are certainly every bit as formidable. So some of the Goliaths that we face are such things as habits that we just can't seem to break. We know they're wrong, we know they're evil, they're against God, but habits that we can't break, or disciplines that we can't seem to master. You know, doing those godly things that God would have us to do, but I just can't quite seem to discipline myself, or the fears, the phobias that I can't quite overcome. I can believe what it says about faith overcoming fear, but yet I'm still paralyzed by fear. Or temptations I just can't seem to walk away from. The list can go on and on and on. Those are the Goliaths that we face. But in this story, David ran quickly to the battle line, and that's the very thing that we need to do. Put on the armor of God and run quickly and deal with the enemy, lest he comes and creates damage and harm for each of us. I think of Nehemiah back in chapter 6, verse 11. Nehemiah faced a lot of enemies trying to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and he said, "Should a man like me run away?" We can take that question to heart as well. When I face my Goliaths, whatever they may be, should a man or woman like me run away? No. There's the time to stand up to the giant, to deal with the giant. Ever keeping in mind that the battle is not ours. Those battles that we face, they are actually God's battles. And that ought to be pretty reassuring for us. We're not in over our heads. We're in a battle that can be won by God because it belongs to Him. We know that we are always outsized. We are always outmatched by our Goliaths, like David was at that time. And I think of us as a church body. I think of the body of Christ, that numerically we're a pretty small army in a world that is tasked with making disciples of all the world. That's about a David and Goliath type of a situation as anything. A few people are supposed to go out and make disciples of all nations. And even as we size up that task, we have an enemy that opposes us and taunts us and says, "You'll never get it done. There's no point in even trying because you're going to fail miserably." Now, the weapons of our warfare are divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We battle in our battle against Goliath. We battle with God's Word. We battle with prayer. We battle with God's Holy Spirit. And I believe that our greatest advances are the ones that we make on our knees. Remember a few weeks ago we showed you a clip from the movie War Room? Very touching, wasn't it? The war room for us, as it was for that lady in that movie, the war room is the prayer closet. That's where we wage war. So we make a list of prayer and spiritual warfare priorities. And with that, we storm the gates of heaven. And we intervene, for example, for government officials that think they're in charge, that need to know that God's in charge. Humble them, God. Humble them under your hand. We wage war for people that are without Christ. Life is fickle. Life is uncertain. They may not have the next moment. They need to come to Christ now. We wage war for compromised believers, brothers or sisters that we know that are walking in disobedience. We wage war on our knees for them to walk faithfully. We face down our Goliaths through the power of prayer. As David said to Goliath, "You come to me with a dagger, a spear, and a sword, but I come to you in the name of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel's armies. You have defied him, that all the world then will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's." Amen, it is.